It's called contextual modernism. The building has setbacks at various levels that correspond to heights of the buildings around it. That makes it fit very well into this sort of piece of the skyline. Also, the glass is sort of a light blue reflective material that allows the, so it sort of blends with the sky color. Now, at the very top of the building, which is condominiums, there's a penthouse unit. And for any of those of you that are looking to buy a piece of Chicago real estate, it's available, but it's only $32 million. And that doesn't even include any furnishings, it's just wide open on the inside. Well, on the right side of us, we have a black glass and steel building, a very simple, elegant building, the MA Plaza, by Mies van der Rohe from 1971. And Mies van der Rohe had a philosophy of less is more, so this is a very simple building. It's basically just a glass box, and all those vertical lines are I-beams. Just standard steel construction that were welded to the outside of the building to give it its own ornamentation and sense of verticality. Well, on the right we have what are sometimes called the corn cobs of Chicago. These two apartment buildings. But there was also an office building, a theater, and all these shops in the marina built with this at the same time, back in 1968. It's called Marina City by Bertram Goldberg. The idea was to create sort of a live-work-play environment to bring people back into the city. During the 60s, a lot of folks had moved out to the suburbs. So Goldberg and the investors of this project, oh, that smells good. Is it lunchtime yet? Well, it's Saturday, we should be having a cookout. It feels like summer. Well, anyway, Mr. Goldberg designed those buildings to show the potential of poured-in-place concrete, which you can form to any shape that you want. Well, coming up on the right side of us here, we have a green glass building here. This used to be the home of Quaker Oats Company, the oatmeal people, and they built this in 1987, excuse me. Bruce Graham from SOM was the architect. The American Bar Association is in here now because the Quaker Oats moved out a while ago. The glass there is green because the architect wanted to pick up on the color of the water in the river, which is sort of an interesting milky green color. The river is even greener if you come on St. Patrick's Day. They dye the river green, it's sort of a food coloring. The Plumbers Union does that. It dyes this entire stretch of the main branch that we're on. Very, very bright. I don't see anyone. Actually, there's a lady here with a scarf that has some green on. That's about the color that the river becomes. Now, on the right side of us, we have an old warehouse that's been turned into offices. This is the Reed Murdoch Center. Built in 1912. The architect was George Nimmons. There used to be many warehouses lining the river back at that time. This building is in the prairie style. If you notice, there's some ornaments at the top of the columns, sort of lighter brown panels that look like plants, perhaps wheat. That was a typical kind of response for prairie school architects. They like to embody elements of the Midwestern landscape in their buildings. Now on the right side of us, we have a building in stainless steel and glass. From 2009, it's by Picard Chilton Architects. It's called 300 North LaSalle. It's got a lot of sustainable features in its design and construction. 2 green roofs that allow the water from rains to be stored in the roofs and the plants and transpired out into the atmosphere. Uses water from the river for the air conditioning system instead of having a cooling tower. And during construction, they used lots of materials that were between a 200 and 500 mile radius of the building for various types. That saved a lot on the energy that it takes to transport materials long distances. That gives that building a LEED rating of gold. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a relatively new system architects use to certify how sustainable their buildings really are. Now this building on the right is a massive building, 4.25 million square feet, and it was built in the early 1930s. Graham Anderson, Probst and White were the designers, and this is the Merchandise Mart. It was the largest building in the world when it was completed back then, until the Pentagon was built a little bit later. Some of you may know how big that building is, and this was large because it was the main warehouse for Marshall Fields and Company. The building has Art Deco features. The windows are set back, and they create grooves, sort of vertical lines that bring your eye up to the top. The ornamentation, those brown diamonds and the chevrons that are next to them, very simple, machine-like geometric forms, and up at the top the building sets back. Those are features you often see on Art Deco buildings, which were very popular during the 20s and early 30s. Now there are 500 showrooms in that building today for the interior design industry, so if you were looking to build a very fancy kitchen or bathroom, that's where you probably go to buy the cabinets and fixtures and things. Now to the right side of us here we have Wolf Point. Wolf Point is where we had the first sort of settlement as far as number of people. This was where we had some residences, a hotel, a tavern, and this is the spot where they picked the word Chicago for this area. And it was from a Native American term that was pronounced roughly Chicagua. And the translation has never been known completely, but they think it's one of three things: smelly onion, skunk, or strong. You can imagine which one of those Chicagoans would hope it would be, not the other two. But what you see here today is a lot of construction. There was a parking lot here for many years, and they are building a residential building to the right here. They're doing all the subsurface work now. This will be, it's about a 50-story building. Then they're going to build 2 office towers next to it. The tallest will be right on the point, and it'll be something like 95 stories. BKL Architects is doing this residential tower here. Well, coming up on the left of us is a building from 2004. This gently curving building here is called the Residences at River Bend by DeStefano Architects. It's a very thin, kind of challenging site because the railroad runs right behind that building, so they were sort of hemmed in between the railroad and the river. So the building is laid out in kind of a unique way. It has the corridor along the back, and then all of the units are just on one side facing the river. And they have a beautiful view until that building is built. Buyer beware in Chicago when you're buying it for the view. Well, to the left we have a pinkish building that is called Fulton House. It was built in 1909. It was a cold storage warehouse. It had no windows in it. It was a giant ice box. In 1988 it was remodeled. Harry Weiss was the architect, and the first thing they had to do is they had to let the building defrost for an entire year before they could do anything. And then they had to haul out 500 truckloads of horsehair and cork that were used as insulation. Imagine what that must have smelled like and been like to pull all that out of there. And then they had to knock all those holes through 1.5 foot thick walls. You could look, especially where the balconies are, you could see the sides there. That shows you how thick those walls were. And that was pretty popular. That was one of the first developments along the river. Then in 1988, Harry Weiss designed these buildings to the left. There are 4 row homes here, the Chicago River Cottages. And if you look at them, you might see portholes, those round windows. The railings and the stairs look a lot like something you see on a steamship. And then there's those triangles that you see in the roof there, might remind you of sails on ships. Harry Weiss believed in redeveloping the river. He was very much for, at that time, the late 70s, early 80s, getting people interested in the river. And no one was down there at the time. He also was a sailor, and he liked to incorporate ship motifs in his designs. Well, the river has gone through a remarkable transformation in the past 20 or 30 years, and you can see it as in the responses that these buildings have had in the architecture to the left, to the right and left of us, showing the change. Now, on the right, this is the East Bank Club. This was built in 1979. It's a very successful health club designed by Gordon Levin Architects, and it's nicknamed with the Jet Set Sweats. And it has a lot of celebrities and famous folk that belong there. And the architects at the time didn't think much of the river. In fact, no one did. So it looks sort of like the back of a building, not too much going on. The plantings were done later so that the building looked a little bit better for these folks on the left. This is Kinsey Park, and look at the difference in how they thought of the river as a nice place, basically. These are all $1.25 million condos. That's what they sold for back then. They all sold out before construction was finished. And this project is from 2002 by Papa George Hames. The units have front doors right on the river. They have very large windows looking out over the space. There's the sort of park-like river walk there, sculpture here that you can see. So between this building on our right and left, there was a real change in how people promoted and thought about the river, and also in its cleanliness. In throughout most of Chicago's history, the lake has always been seen as the front yard of the city. But in the past 25, 30 years, there's been a real effort to make the river another sort of front yard, if you will, and recreational corridor site where people would want to live and shop. And so this river has really been, it's in the process of transformation, but it's come a long way. So we have, what we're going to see are some new buildings like Kinsey Park, or relatively new, and some rehabilitated ones too, like on the right. This was a bookbinding company. It was built in 1912. It's known as East Bank Lofts today, or Riverbank Lofts, excuse me. And it was designed by George Nimmons back in the early teens. It's an example of soft loft conversions. You might be able to see inside a little bit there, but mostly It's drywall in there, the way they've designed the units and built them, and it has a few flourishes of the original building. There might be a brick wall or two, some timbers and things, but mostly it's sort of traditional plans with a lot of drywall. A hard loft is where they take an old building, they don't do much with it at all. Leave everything exposed, create great big spaces that don't have rooms but sort of different purpose areas in them, like you'd find an artist in Soho living in New York. We don't have a lot of those along the river here in Chicago. Most of them are the soft lofts. Here we have a park. This is a neighborhood park that sort of anchors this little development here. It's called Montgomery Ward Park. And the building that's sitting on it over there that has those diagonal braces is by Lucien Lagrange. It is known as Erie on the park. And it's a European modernism kind of design, which is you don't see too many of those in Chicago for residential buildings. The bracing, those big diagonals you see on the side of the building, are there to help stabilize the building a bit because it's a parallelogram. And that's not the most inherently stable kind of shape. Not that it's going to fall down, but it just needed some extra bracing. They exposed it. Now to the right you'll see a building that has back there white corners in that blue glass. The white corner building sits back a block or two. That building was completed in 1974. It was the corporate headquarters for the Montgomery Ward Company. Some of you may remember Montgomery Ward. They were a mail order firm, and they had stores in towns. They were sort of a competitor to Sears, and from what I remember they were nicknamed Monkey Ward. That company built that in 1974, and it was designed by Monero, proposed Navy Pier, which we'll see in a little bit, and so that was probably the best and longest lasting legacy of the fair, was how it helped improve cities all over the country. Well, we are back in the junction here, and the junction is where we have the branches of the river coming together. We've been on the north branch. We started out on the main branch, which is over to the left there, and we'll go back through there again. And we're about to head down the south branch as we pass those kayakers coming up on the right there. You'll see all kinds of boats out on the river today. Everything from kayaks to commercial vessels, and you may even see a barge or two. Well, I mentioned how there's a railroad that goes behind the River Bend project, and it goes underneath this platform. This is to be a new public park that's going to be in front of an office building. This is a very hot spot for construction. 45-story office building called River Point over there by Picard Chilton, Wolf Point project, and then another high-rise on the other side of this bridge here. Well, the river, with this railroad running alongside of it, creates, but this white material, it was one of the first uses of what's called precast concrete. That's what that is. And precast concrete is concrete that is poured into molds in a factory off-site, and then it cures, and the pieces are brought out and lifted up and attached to the building. There is a piece here of Gateway 3 that's of note, this building with the X's. This was a trading floor for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. It's been divided into subfloors, but it was one big space. Those X's are there to provide lateral stability, cross-bracing, so the building didn't twist in the wind. It's by Fazler Khan. He engineered it. We'll talk about Fazler Khan some more when we see the Willis Tower in a few minutes. And finally, this is the last of the Gateway series of buildings from 1980. This one's 1883, excuse me. This is a little bit different. It's by Jim DeStefano. This building is trying to say something about its site and what's around it. That was a new thing back in the early 80s. So it has a curve carved out of it. That curve is meant to refer to the flow of water, the fluidity of the river. And then as you look at each of these glass panels as we go by straight on, they're each convex and they're reflective. So you can see the buildings around us and the scene that's sort of in this sort of kaleidoscopic pattern. So what you're seeing here is the architect letting the building tell a little bit of the story about what's around it, which was start of a phase of design and architecture called postmodernism. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Here on our right we have a very large building that doesn't look like it's in very good shape. That's because this building's been abandoned basically since 1996. This was the former main post office for Chicago, completed in the early 1930s. Graham Anderson, Probst, and White were the architects. It was the largest post office in the world when it was completed. And that is because Chicago, with Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward, and had a tremendous amount of mail that was going in and out, so it needed a huge post office. Another interesting feature of this building is that it has a tunnel through the middle of it. This roadway, this is Commons Parkway, goes right through the middle of the building, and on the other side, as it emerges, it becomes the Eisenhower Expressway. The building they had a hard time finding buyers. because it's such a big building and it has so much maintenance that needs to be done just to base in our view. So we'll slowly pause in case you want to snap a few images here. Thinner. And then the middle of the building has the windows that are set back again to create vertical lines that lead your eye up towards the top to that statue. Art Deco was the era of steamships and zeppelins and first airplanes, so there was a real interest into the design world on streamlining, movement, verticality. So Art Deco buildings kind of express the jazz age, the 20s and early 30s. Now this was the tallest building in Chicago until a little bit after, well actually in the mid-50s. And it was designed by Halliburton and Root. The sculpture that's up on top is a good symbol of the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade basically helps set the prices of food. And that is Ceres up there. Ceres was the Roman goddess of agriculture. And that's where we get the word cereal from. And the sculpture is by John Storr. Right in front of the Willis Tower, there is a pink high-rise, pink stone-clad high-rise that has up at the top a sort of white cylinder. And it's by Cone Pedersen and Fox Architects from 1990. It's called 311 South Wacker. It's an apartment building, but what it's mostly known for is that light fixture up at the very top, that cylinder. There are 1,400 light bulbs in there. They're fluorescent tubes. And when it's turned on, it's pretty bright. But when the building first opened, it had double the amount of light fixtures up there. And when they first turned it on in 1990 or so, it was so bright that people in these surrounding buildings were complaining. They were basically looking out their windows and getting blinded by this thing. And they had trouble with birds that were crashing into it. So they asked them to tone it down, but it's still pretty bright. So after we get under the bridge here, we'll get a good view of the Willis Tower, called Sears Tower until not too long ago, but the Sears Tower was the world's tallest building when it was completed in 1974. Bruce Graham was the architect and Fazlur Khan was the engineer. Both worked for Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. It stands at 1,454 feet tall, 442 meters, 110 stories. And the Fazlur Khan came up with the structural concept. It's called a bundled tube. There are 9 75-foot square tubes. You could think of the building as almost as very simply as 9 high-rises that are just all grouped together. The black lines that you see going up the facade, as we get into view of it here again, there are 2 black lines along the facade. Those divide this into 3 tubes. So you can see there's 3 tubes here. It's a 3x3 matrix, so there's 9 tubes. They go up to different levels and they stop. But there's 2 of the tubes that go all the way up to the top and have the antenna. So you can think of it almost as like bundled wreaths as a way of thinking about how it provides stability to the building. It also works nicely because the lower floors are very large. They get smaller as you go up. That fit their space program because they had all these big offices that they needed on the lower floors where you had hundreds of clerical workers. The building by Handel Architects is called 111 West Wacker. It's about to be completed very soon. Now we have an example of a postmodern building to our right. This building mixes together modernism and historic features. The bottom floors here have those triangular pediments in the semicircle. Those you might find on a building from the Renaissance era, say 1500. Up at the very top there's a Greek temple-like form. So it's mixing together old and new. And that's what postmodernism was about. It was from the late 60s until about the early 90s. And it's when architects were getting a little bit tired of just doing sort of anonymous glass boxes, so they kind of livened it up with some other ornamentation. That's by Ricardo Bofill. He's from Spain. The building was completed in 1992. Now all this construction that you see here is to extend the Riverwalk another 6 blocks You can see some steel sheet piling, zigzaggy material there. That's the new riverfront. They brought out the river edge 25 feet into the water for a wide surface for pedestrian facilities, cafes, all kinds of things to be done in about 3 years. Now if you look up on your right, you'll see a building that has a gold top up there. That is genuine gold leaf. It's a very thin building. That is the Hard Rock Hotel. It was the Carbon and Carbide building when it was completed in 1928. And the architects, Burnham Brothers, were inspired by a champagne bottle we saw at a New Year's Eve party for that green and gold color scheme. Here's the completed part of the Riverwalk here. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial of Illinois is over there behind that fountain. And the building that sits behind all that, that's very ornate, that has those little temples on the corners, and up at the top a rotunda that's hard to see because the sun is right there. But that rotunda, during Prohibition, was a speakeasy run by Al Capone. It was designed by Alfred Alschuler. It's called 360 North Michigan Avenue today, and it's being turned into a boutique hotel. That's what the construction is. But the London Guarantee Company was pretty important. They were based out of London. They were an insurance firm, basically, that insured ships that went back and forth between Europe and the United States. Now we are going past where we had our first permanent non-native settler, Jean-Baptiste Pointe-de-Sable. His cabin would have been over to the left of us here. And when he was here, he was the first non-Native American, and when he was here, this was the corner of the river and the lake. This is basically where the lakefront was, right where we're at. So as you look ahead of us, everything to the left and right is landfill that's been put in over the decades. And to the right we have Illinois Center, and this was started in the late 60s into the 70s. It has a mix of different building types. The brown brick buildings here, there's 2 of them. They're paired together down below in a concourse. But that's the largest hotel in Chicago, 2,000 rooms. It's the Hyatt Regency, designed by Epstein Architects. This is a multi-level. There's 3 levels of circulation here. Really great river walk over here. That's a good spot for ice cream over there if you're and drinks. Cyrano's. Keep thinking about food. I kept after smelling the charcoal back then. There's also a new building. If you look to your right, you'll see that tall building. The sun is right there, but it has white undulating balconies. We'll get a chance to see it again. That building that sits back 1 layer. It's 81 stories tall. It's called Aqua. Aqua is the tallest building in the world. It's designed by a woman who owns her own firm. Her name is Jeannie Gang, and the firm's name is Studio Gang Architecture. You'll see that building again between these buildings. There you can see those balconies that come out between 2 and 12 feet. And as you look at the facade as we go by, it's a very interesting wavy pattern that's created by the different dimensions that comes out. The balconies help shade the glass from the summer sun, and they're meant to give the idea of weathered rock outcroppings, the kind that you'd find if you went out into the Midwest where rivers have eroded some of the natural limestone bedrock. It also kind of looks like water, hence the name Aqua, flowing over the facade. Now we have also, I can mention something about the tall buildings in Chicago. You saw the Willis Tower. That's the tallest in the city. The second tallest is the Trump Tower that's right directly ahead of, to the left of us. The third tallest is the Aon Building. The Aon Building is to our left. It's sort of concealed. It rises up above this group just to the left of the river there. It's white and black, very vertical lines. It almost looks like corduroy. The Aon Building was built in 1974, and Edward Durrell Stone was the architect of that. The Aon Building is infamous for what happened to its facade. That white material that you see there today was originally marble, and it came from the quarry that Michelangelo had used for his sculptures. But it wasn't detailed very well, and it didn't work in Chicago's winters, and so it started to buckle. And they had to take every single piece of marble off that building and replace it with white North Carolina granite. And that cost something like $80 million. And that was about half of what it cost to build the building originally back in the early 70s. Well, as we're doing a slow turn here on your right, we get a good view of Navy Pier, this very long building that juts out about a half mile into the lake. And you can see there's a Ferris wheel. The white structure there is a tent over the Skyline stage and outdoor performance area. The glass building there with the curve is a conservatory. This building has the little towers, has the Chicago Children's Museum and IMAX Theater. And further beyond, the Chicago Shakespeare Theater is there in glass, and then a convention hall and a ballroom, along with lots of restaurants and bars. That is the #1 tourist attraction in the state of Illinois. 9 million people will go there on a yearly basis. It was built in 1918. It was called Municipal Pier back then. The Ferris wheel was included over there because Chicago is where the Ferris wheel was invented. This was for the World's Fair of 1890.